Today we're going to focus on nuclear fission, and we're mostly going to be talking about large scale. So big power plants, because that is what has actually been providing electricity commercially. We'll talk a little bit about small modular reactors at the end of lecture today, but it is very much in the research stage, not even in the demonstration stage yet. So mostly we're going to talk about what's actually supplying power to our systems today. Okay, and so this is one of the field trips we go on. This is Rancho Seco. This is outside of Sacramento. It is a decommissioned nuclear power plant. So the guys that take us on the tour, they worked at it, and now they got to take it apart. That process took a long time. I think they started taking it apart in the mid-'80s is when nuclear power plants shut down. And they were definitely still taking it apart, in the 90s and early 2000s. This is what's left. So you still have the cooling towers, you still have the containment where that other vessel is where the nuclear reaction took place. It's now open, but it's still there. It's expensive to take that kind of infrastructure down, so a lot of times they just leave it. And it's become a solar farm. So they're making use of that electricity infrastructure that went to the nuclear power plant. And it's been a growing solar farm. So a nice thing about solar is it's modular. So they could put some, and then they can grow it, and then they can grow it, and they can just keep growing it as they have funding to add to that solar facility. So kind of the story broadly in one location in terms of our electricity system. Okay, so big picture questions really for your reference, but a lot of this is about like what's happening in the industry. What are we doing with waste, and what are some of the concerns, and what role does nuclear play? And there's different flavors of nuclear. So we're talking about big nuclear today, but we can talk about small modular and fusion as other things. Give you a sense of where it's going. There were a lot of readings and videos. If you're interested in this area, I recommend digging into some of the optional useful ones. There's a pretty good list. This, I think, is one of the most famous nuclear power plants on the planet. For Springfield nuclear power plant from The Simpsons. This is like a typical nuclear power plant. So some things you guys talk about, there's a lot of security. It says double fencing and stuff, a guard gate. There's going to be a lot of security around our nuclear power plants. That's very different from like our wind and solar, which might have minimal security. So you do have a whole security system to maintain that safety and restrict access to something that could cause significant regional impacts if something happened at the plant, right? So they worry about terrorism, things like that. When we go to Diablo Canyon, which is California's last nuclear power plant that's operating down in San Luis Obispo, right on the ocean, getting through security takes several hours. And they have almost like a small army guarding the plant. So security is a big deal. Some other features. This nuclear power plant looks like it's got 2 nuclear reactors. These are the nuclear reactor vessels right here. So that's common. A lot of times you'll have more than one unit on a single site. Diablo Canyon has 2 units. 2 units is pretty typical. And they can be as big as a gigawatt. Each of those units, you could have a 2 gigawatt power plant. Some of them are going to be more like 500 megawatt and have a 1 gigawatt total power plant with 500 megawatt units. And then we already talked about these big things are the cooling towers, right? So that's just where we're doing the cooling for the steam cycle of the power plant. This would be your operations building. This is just where you're monitoring everything. One of the things to think about with nuclear, it's super energy dense. We're going to look at how energy dense it is. So that's one thing that proponents are really excited about nuclear is how energy dense the material is. We get a lot of energy out of just a little bit of uranium. We have a very high capacity factor. Guys, we've talked about what capacity factor means. That means that we're making high utilization of these nuclear power plants. Part of that is because they're slow to turn on and off. So once you get them running, you don't want to be moving them up and down. So it's kind of, you have to keep it up and running. But it also has to do a lot with the reliability. We've figured out we have redundancy. We figured out how to run these power plants at a very high availability and reliability. And then, of course, no carbon emissions or air pollution. Challenges. Okay, so we talked about the waste and accidents, things like Chernobyl, security, expensive. A lot of that leads to this long lead time. So not only does it take a long time to build a nuclear power plant, but it takes a long time for the permit and planning of a nuclear power plant. So we'll talk about how long that is. It varies country to country, but we're talking on the scales of, 10 to 18 years for planning and building a nuclear power plant. So that can be a long time. Safety and flexible, they're big. Big can be both good and bad. It's good if it's a reliable resource, not as good if it's not a flexible resource. It's bad if it goes down. It's hard to make up that amount of electricity all in one location. And then you talked about some of the challenges with water and what people think about nuclear. Things that are like trends that are happening and things we'll talk more about. It's been declining in the United States, in Europe and Japan, but growing in places like China and the Middle East for nuclear power. But there's still more nuclear power plants in the United States than anywhere else in the world by a long, long margin. So we still have the most. There's questions we'll talk more about. Will we be restarting them? And what's the future of small modular reactors? So big picture for you guys to take away from this, nuclear is complicated. It's complicated on a lot of different aspects. It's complicated technology, it's complicated safety, and then it's complicated this intergenerational challenges that we see with nuclear in the waste. All right, so this is what nuclear power trends look like. You can see it kind of coming online in the late 60s, early 70s is when we really started using nuclear for power. A lot of growth here in the United States, and then it's leveled off. And even with the shutdown of our nuclear power plants, we've only seen kind of a small decline in nuclear electricity production in the United States. Europe, you can see there's been a longer trend of decline in nuclear. And then, of course, Asia Pacific is seeing growth, but it has that one major dip. What happened there? Fukushima, right? So Fukushima was a turning point for Japan. Japan was highly dependent on nuclear power. Japan has a challenge where it doesn't have a lot of fossil natural resources. So it has to import oil, coal, natural gas if it wants to use any of those things. It has to import nuclear, but with the high energy density, it's something that it chose to rely a lot on. It shut down all of its power plants after Fukushima, has slowly brought some back online, but it's not back up to where it was before Fukushima. So you see that big dip. A lot of the growth that you see in Asia Pacific is really taking place in China. So this is what it looks on our pie charts, right? It's a pretty small percentage of our world and U.S. energy use, but a bigger percent of electricity because all nuclear is used for electricity today. That's what we use it for. There are thoughts or people thinking about using it to make hydrogen. You could use the nuclear system to make hydrogen, but right now we're really just using it to make electricity. So almost 10% in the world, 18% in the US. When I was in your seat, it was 20%. So we've seen a little bit of a drop as electricity demand has grown and natural gas, wind and solar have really taken over. Nuclear has come down a little bit. This is a big reason why a lot of people support nuclear is that it's carbon-free. So providing 41% of the carbon-free electricity in 2024, if you're thinking about which pieces of these are carbon-free, it's a big piece of that pie. And so let's look at some charts on the growth and what's happening. Okay, so here I'm showing you in the world both generation and capacity. Capacity is just a measure of what's online, right? And the generation is how much is actually being produced. And here it is in the United States. So again, a lot of that growth early in the 70s. You can see growth has continued in the world, but it's kind of a slow pace of growth because we're seeing growing in some places and declining in others. And then the United States, you can see capacity is coming down, but we're looking at or planning on restarting. And so we'll probably see that capacity come back up. But generation has been relatively steady. Markets are impacting the nuclear as well as other costs. And so in places where we talk about where we have wholesale markets, nuclear really can't compete with these other resources. And that's why it's been on the decline. This is to give you a sense of what scale the nuclear industry is in different parts of the world. So what this chart is showing you is not only the ones that are currently operating, but also ones that are closed or under construction, things like that. And so you can really see the United States really dominates in terms of how many reactors we have or have had, both operating and that have gone offline. And then the under construction, the orange, you can really see that China, some in the Middle East are where we're seeing more of the growth in nuclear. And just to give that in a single line in terms of operable nuclear reactors, you can see United States still way more nuclear reactors operating than anywhere else in the world. And some places like Germany have shut them all down. UAE just started about 5 years ago, and they now have 4 online. That's where we're seeing the growth. We talked some about geopolitics and challenges with like natural gas and things like that in this class. I also want to highlight one of the challenges with nuclear is when we end up with something like a nuclear power plant in the middle of a war zone. Because you have a lot of safety systems in order to keep that nuclear reactor from releasing nuclear radioactive elements, you have to have those systems running in order to keep the waste cool and things like that. And so one of the challenges that we saw with Russia's invasion of Ukraine was this very large nuclear power plant, a lot of question about safety, and outside auditors wanted to come in and make sure that those safety systems were running. So it's an aspect that you wouldn't see in like a wind or a solar or even a natural gas plant, because you have those radioactive elements that could cause a lot of harm if they were released. And so you really need those safety systems operating. Ukraine has quite a few nuclear power plants, has gotten a lot of its electricity production from nuclear power, and is the site of Chernobyl. So we'll talk more about Chernobyl in a minute, but it's just another aspect. It's that safety and security that we have to think about with our nuclear power plants. All right, so that's like where it is and where it is in the world. But even though we have more nuclear reactors in the world, we only get about 18% of our power from nuclear. Other countries are much more reliant on nuclear. France has long been a leader in terms of its percentage of electricity generation from nuclear. We'll talk a little bit more about France, but you can see that there's, almost a dozen countries that get about 30% of their electricity generation from nuclear. So it can be a big portion of your electricity mix. Places like France, one of the advantages they have is it's an interconnected grid with other parts of Europe. So even though the nuclear isn't flexible to help them meet supply and demand, they can import and export that nuclear to other neighboring countries. And so we talked about regional integration. Regional integration helps smooth out supply and demand curves. And so it can help maintain a high base load mix because you can supply that electricity other places. And then you can see Japan, it's back up to about 8% of its electricity generation from nuclear. It was 30% before Fukushima, so it was a much bigger percentage of their mix. We'll talk about some of the things Japan did to try to make up for that change. And this is just kind of the pie chart of where we're at. You can see where China's grown a lot in nuclear. All right, let's talk about the United States. So not only is it a big portion of electricity generation in certain countries, it's a big portion of electricity generation in certain states. So you can look for your favorite state here. Illinois has a very large electricity mix from nuclear, South Carolina as well. Here in California, it's only about 10%. Actually, I think it's more like 8% now of our electricity mix from that one nuclear power plant. We'll look at that in a second. But you can integrate a lot of nuclear into your mix. You just have to have other resources or other things that are flexible to help follow your demand curve. So we have a lot of reactors. It tends to be a lot more expensive nuclear in the United States in terms of building reactors. It's a very capitalist way of doing things. We don't have a government agency that builds nuclear reactors like a lot of other countries do. It has to be an individual company that's taking on that build. So we have a lot of different operating companies, a lot of different designs. That can mean there can be a lot of innovation, but it also can mean that it's more costly because we don't have a cookie cutter way of making nuclear reactors. And so that can be a challenge for the industry. And I said we look at California. So here's California. Here's our nuclear wedge down here. So it's about 9% of our electricity demand. With Diablo Canyon, our last 2 gigawatt nuclear power plant that's online. San Onofre, it's the one that went offline here. It actually went offline and just to do maintenance, and then the maintenance went poorly. They were redoing their steam generator, and they had all sorts of leaks, and it got too costly, and so then it just remained down. So that's down in San Diego on the beach. You guys had a video where they talked about the waste that's being stored on that site. These are other two. I talked about Rancho Seco, which went down in the 80s. So they've been decommissioning. They decommissioned that one for a long time. Humboldt Bay was really a little facility. Decommissioning was just finished a few years ago. We'll talk about the decommissioning part of a nuclear power plant cycle. Is actually a very long process, an expensive process, and something that has to be taken into account when you're thinking about the costs of our nuclear power. So here's beautiful Diablo Canyon. I said it's like right on the ocean. This is down in San Luis Obispo. What is this? Water for the cooling, exactly. Wasn't meant to be a trick question. Yeah, so they use once-through cooling, which is no longer allowed in California, although power plants do have time frames where they're allowed to switch over. So they basically have an inlet that's deep ocean that's farther out, and this is the outlet. So this water is about 20 degrees warmer than the water they're bringing in. That's typically for a once-through cooling. That means that this bay is actually a lot warmer than the ocean around it. And they have a lot of biologists and stuff that kind of monitor the health of this bay. And one of the things they notice is that the sea life that exists here are like sea life that you normally wouldn't see here that are usually more in warmer parts of the ocean. And so it's not so much that you don't have a good biological mix, it's just not the mix that would be there if they didn't have this outflow from the nuclear power plant. So yes, that is our cooling water. Those are our 2 1 gigawatt nuclear reactors. Each have their own steam cycle power plant, so generating electricity. So you can shut down one at a time. In the United States, we haven't been building new nuclear power plants, and we haven't been doing that for a long time. This is to give you a sense of when the capacity was added by its initial year of operation. So lots of growth in the 70s, some more growth in the 80s. This was actually finishing one that was started in the 70s when we were going to have a resurgence. So this is its initial year of operation, but it was started a long time ago. And then we have this one new nuclear power plant. So in the 70s, 3 Mile Island had a very, very small release of radioactive waste. It was through a pressure valve. It was just pressure relief. It's human error. Nobody was hurt. There weren't any long-term impacts, but there was a lot of fear. And so these builds that continued to happen had already been commissioned and approved prior to 3 Mile Island. It pretty much stopped any new nuclear being built in the United States. We tried to have a resurgence in the 2015s. There was an energy bill federally that gave a lot of subsidies to nuclear to try to get it going again. It wasn't successful in really getting a restart, but it is why we have kind of these 2 new nuclear power plants. We'll talk more about these 2. This one in particular that just started up a couple years ago. Yes, so 3 Mile Island was a big, big deal. So because we have old nuclear power plants, a lot of them, this wouldn't be unusual to go see their control room. It's very pneumatic, not a lot of automated. I talked to some of the workers and they're like, well, this is a lot harder to hack from a computer security system idea. But it is, there has been upgrades. I don't want to say there aren't upgrades, but they are they're old power plants. And so their original licenses were for 40 years, and then they have to be audited, and then they can get an extension on that license. And so the NRC, that's our government agency that covers that. They get these, you basically have to renew your license, and a lot of times that's when upgrades have to happen, is when you're going through that license renewal, because their original lifetime was for that 40-year period. Obviously, a lot of them are beyond that 40 years. So the question is, when they become up for the license renewal, will they continue to operate, or will they shut down? A lot of that depends on subsidies or states or something like that, because we talked about how they have trouble competing on the wholesale market. So some states have just decided to subsidize them for being a zero carbon resource, or for the jobs, or for the taxes, or things like that. So it becomes a political question on whether to keep those nuclear plants operating. So the two main reasons that we've seen a lot of these shutdowns in the United States, one is the upgrades that are required when they get to the end of their life. And so that's where San Onofre ran into problems. They did these upgrades, and then they didn't go well. And so they decided to shut it down. And then it's really just competing with natural gas, wind, and solar. And so this chart is from NextEra. They're the ones that run more wind and solar in the United States than any other company. This is what they see as the market rates. So near firm wind and solar, that's with batteries. So that's like with a 4-hour battery, is cheaper than running existing coal or nuclear. And so just the market forces make it really hard to keep nuclear. And we're going to talk about why it's so costly for nuclear power plants. So what have we been seeing? We've been seeing shutdowns. So these are charts just showing shutdowns. These are shutdowns that have been happening for different nuclear power plants. You can see 3 Mile Island was shut down in 2019. Indian Point, other places, Palisades was in Michigan, was shut down. Diablo Canyon was supposed to be shut down the last 2 years, but it was extended to 2030 with a lot of government funds because it's that zero carbon resource. And so California was trying to make sure that it had enough electricity capacity to meet its zero carbon goals, and has extended that. That's been controversial. One of the challenges with Diablo Canyon is it's right on an earthquake fault that they weren't aware of when they built it. And so it's had some earthquake upgrades, but it's definitely a lot of concerns about the earthquake challenges with Diablo Canyon and its location. And then you can see the new nuclear power plants that came online. So you guys mentioned this in our Energy in the News. Our nuclear power plant is going to start reopening to meet some of the big demand centers like data centers and AI. And so these are, instead of it competing like on an open market, these are going to be more like things we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about renewals, like power purchases agreements. So it'd be an agreement between Microsoft and the nuclear power plant, and actually purchasing that power at some price where they want the reliability and they want the zero carbon electricity from the nuclear power plant. So we'll see if that's happening. Palisades is also another one that might be coming back online. This is a little bit more about Palisades. So it's taking a lot of loans, both state and federal money. It's an 800 megawatt power plant. It closed because of financial issues, and it has upgrades that need to happen. Just like San Onofre saw, they have to upgrade their steam generators. So that can be a very costly process. For San Onofre, it was several $100 million to do that. But it has a planned restart date at the latest I saw was October of this year. We'll see if they meet that. And so this might be one of the first ones to come back online. And their plans anyways say that they're planning to double the capacity with small modular reactors in the 2030s. We don't have small modular reactors online yet today. So this, I would say, still remains a question. We have some approved. There was one that was going to be built. We're not really even to demonstration phase for SMR. So we'll talk more about that. And then these are just kind of a pictorially This is where 3 Mile Island and Microsoft, Amazon's talked about another one. So we'll see what happens with nuclear power supplying those data centers. Last couple of things I want to talk about just on setting the stage of nuclear is building new nuclear in the construction times. So what this is showing you here is by time period, how long does it take in months to build a new nuclear power plant? And this is really for the building of that nuclear power plant. And you can see that it varies depending on different years. Here's the latest data we have in 2023. But construction itself is 7 to 10 years. And then depending on where you are, you also have the planning and permitting process that can take another decade. And so when you're thinking about it's a highly capital upfront cost investment that you're taking 20 years to think about demand and things like that. And so that's part of the reason like building new nuclear in the United States has been really challenging. And I would say that's part of the reason that if Microsoft or Amazon or others are looking at nuclear, they're looking to restart existing. They're hoping that's going to be less permitting, less time to get something restarted than to build new. And we just don't have a robust nuclear industry in the United States because we haven't been building it for a long time. To talk about that one new nuclear power plant that was built for Georgia Power and did finally start up. At the time when these were in planning, so that was in the 2004-2005 timeframe, we believed you were going to have this resurgence in nuclear industry in the United States. Toshiba bought Westinghouse because Westinghouse was going to be the new design for these nuclear power plants. You can see they had about 8 years for planning. Plan was 10 years for construction. They were about 7 years over time on this one. This one was 3 years old over time, and they stopped. And you can see how much over budget they were. 20 billion over budget for that one. When they stopped, they were like 20 billion over budget on this one as well. This one is still under some lawsuits. And you can see it almost bankrupt Toshiba. There was like the CEO had to resign and things like that just for trying to restart new nuclear power plants in the United States with Westinghouse. So the challenges with these two, and especially I would say with this one, ratepayers are going to be paying for that construction and not getting a single kilowatt hour of electricity. $2.3 billion is going to be collected from ratepayers over 20 years just for a plant that never got started. And so you can see that the nuclear, like new nuclear, is facing some really challenging, a challenging landscape in the United States where we don't have the government and standardization and other things doing that. Okay, so let's talk about how it works and what the history and origins are. So yes, E equals mc squared. We're getting energy from splitting atoms when we're talking about fission. When we first started doing fission, it was for defense. So it does have its origins in the Department of Defense and building a nuclear bomb. If you talk to people that kind of, lived through this time, there was a lot of fear obviously about nuclear bombs and nuclear war and the devastation. And there was an effort to want to do something good with this amazingly high energy dense resource we had figured out. So there was a lot of investment put into how can we use this for beneficial use. We use nuclear power for almost all of our submarines. The benefits of that are pretty obvious. It's pretty high energy dense. It doesn't burn, so you're not producing CO2. You're not using up oxygen inside a submarine, things you wouldn't want to do when people are living in there. So almost all of our nuclear power submarines are almost like a little small modular reactor, right? They're just a little nuclear reactor. This is where a lot of our nuclear expertise comes from, actually, is more in the Department of Defense than in the private sector. And then this, I just love this. This is like, just to give you a sense of the time frame. So in the 50s is when we had our first nuclear power plant, was producing 20% of our electricity by the 70s. So in just a 20-year time frame, we grew a lot. And it's the sense that nuclear was going to provide this cheap form of electricity. And one of the things they talked about at this time was electricity was going to be too cheap to meter. It was going to be so inexpensive because we had this way of making electricity with nuclear that we wouldn't have to worry about our electricity supply. That was kind of the sentiment then. And then, of course, we had 3 Mile Island with a lot of fear. And then the whole industry kind of stalled out in the United States. One of the key things that had to happen in order to even start a nuclear industry in the United States was to have a policy that took on the risk. So I said, unlike other countries where it's like a government agency, you know, France has a government agency, they have that are actually owning, operating, building the nuclear power plants. In the United States, it is very much private companies that are doing this, or private-public partnerships with utilities. And so they didn't want to take on the liability of building a nuclear power plants. And so a very key policy was something called the Price-Anderson Act of 1957, which limits the liability that's placed on the operators. Basically, the government is the backstop. It is the insurer of the nuclear power plants. And without a policy like that, private investors would probably not have taken on, and certainly not at the scale of these nuclear power plants because of the risks associated. So a lot of government funding, backup, investment, research, things like that have gone into our nuclear energy industry in order to have it at the scale that we have today. For a long time, the government was the owner of all of the fuel, so it took care of the whole fuel cycle. It is still the government's job to take care of the waste. It's not the private operators. They have to collect some money, but it is the government's job to take care of the waste from the nuclear power plants. So it is very subsidized in a lot of these different aspects. So there's a lot here. You can go through and look at it. We'll talk more about waste and decommissioning in a minute. Not only is it need this policy and this insurance, but a lot of government money still goes to managing our nuclear aspects. Some of that is for our nuclear weapons, and some of it is other like nuclear waste disposal, things like that. And so this just gives you a sense that a lot of the Department of Energy's budget is actually going to backstop or cover parts of our nuclear, both our nuclear weapons industry and our nuclear energy industry. My favorite nuclear engineer right there. There aren't glowing bars of nuclear waste. That is definitely just a Simpsons thing. Okay, so we're going to talk about fission today, but I just wanted to give you context on what we're talking about. So fusion is where we take little atoms and we squeeze them together, and that releases a lot of energy. Those tend to be isotopes of hydrogen. In fission, we're taking a really big, relatively unstable atom, we're hitting it with neutrons, and when it splits apart, it releases a lot of energy in neutrons. And so that tends to be uranium. We're hitting it with a neutron, and more neutrons come off, right? And that's what causes our chain reaction. So this is what we're doing commercially. And then, of course, those products that we come out are radioactive. And that's the challenge with that. So we're typically using uranium. Key terms to know are fissile and fertile. So fissile is an isotope of uranium, U-235. It's capable of capturing that neutron and undergoing fission. It's ready. It's like, let's do this. You hit it with a neutron, it's going to start that reaction, and it can be used directly. U-238 is what's called fertile. That means it needs to capture a neutron first, and then you can be hit again with a neutron, and then it'll become fissile. So it has to kind of undergo a little bit more before it's able to start contributing to that chain reaction. What exists naturally when you find uranium? It's mostly U-238 with a little bit of U-235. And so when you hear about enrichment, which you might have heard about, what you're doing is trying to increase the percentage of 235 to 238. You want more of that in order to be able to use it. So that's our chain reaction. For these reactions, you see that it talks about a slow neutron, and they actually come off the reaction fast. We want something to slow them down a little bit for the chain reaction to happen in a productive manner. So you have to have a moderator. Most of the time, that moderator in the nuclear reactor is water. That's by far the predominant way we do it. Chernobyl, which we'll talk about, used graphite as the moderator. Challenge with using graphite is that it burns. And so once they started a meltdown and they started burning the moderator, there wasn't really a way of containing it and stopping that reaction from happening. So graphite is no longer really used. Now we pretty much always use water as moderators. I say pretty much. I'm not actually sure if there are some older nuclear power plants in places like Russia, because that's where a lot of the graphite was used as a moderator. But water is the typical way we use as a thing we use as a moderator. Water doesn't burn and also can help to cool down a reaction. So we talked about how energy dense nuclear is, and I can't bring any nuclear pellets in, but I do have fake ones that I can pass around. Okay, so just to give you a sense, if you have a 1 gigawatt power plant, which Diablo Canyon's a 2 gigawatt power plant, it's giant, right? You have 2 gigawatt power plants. But if you had 1 gigawatt power plant, you would need 191 trains of 110 cars for your annual fuel supply for a coal-fired power plant, if it's 1 gigawatt. For fission, for uranium, you need one train car. So to give you a sense of scale of like how energy dense uranium truly is, fusion is even more energy dense, and we'll talk about that in another lecture. So the way we're going to talk about how the technology works is basically to follow the fuel through the fuel cycle and through producing electricity. So first, you guys talked about we got to mine for it. We got to find the uranium. The way we find uranium is a little bit different than finding, things like coal. We do geology. We do try to figure out where it might be located. But you can actually use a Geiger counter. You can actually find it by measuring the radioactivity of the uranium itself. So we know where a lot of the uranium ores are. This gives you a sense that, uranium ore is pretty, you can have high grade or low grade. Some research has gone into, you can actually get uranium from seawater. It's in our ocean water in terms of uranium, but you can see it's at pretty low concentrations. And it's not economic. We're just kind of like with coal, we're not running out of uranium. We have plenty. So we haven't had to look very hard for it, unlike something like oil. So we're not running out in any sense. The major suppliers of uranium, Kazakhstan is the biggest producer. This is where most of the uranium is. It's kind of in these 5 countries. Kazakhstan and Australia being big ones. And then Kazakhstan is where most of it's coming from. And that's been a growing export for Kazakhstan in the last, I would say, 20 to 30 years. Where do we get it domestically? We don't make it a lot. We don't mine a lot of uranium domestically. So a lot of our uranium for the United States is imported. Kazakhstan, Canada, Australia kind of being the big partners where we have been importing it. The latest date is 2023. So almost all of the uranium that we use in the United States is imported. We do have some deposits of uranium. You can kind of see it on this map. One place that has been a controversial place for uranium mining is near the Grand Canyon. There's a lot of concern about opening a mine there and having leakage into the Colorado River, which supplies a lot of the water for agriculture in the Southwest. But every once in a while, you'll hear that come up again about opening that uranium mine near the Grand Canyon. But primarily, we're doing the uranium mining in other countries and importing it. There's 2 ways you can get uranium mining. One of them is very similar to that open pit coal mining, right? Where you're just taking the stuff off the land, you're blasting off the rock that's above it, and you're getting to the uranium ore, and you're just digging it out of the ground. That's open pit mining that is done in some locations. It used to be about half and half in terms of like the open pit versus in situ. Kazakhstan primarily does in situ, so as it's grown there, our in situ leaching operations have become more dominant. And what that is it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more like oil drilling for the uranium. So, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. And then we do get it as a byproduct as for other mining. That just means that like when you're mining for something else, you might have some uranium too, and then you can sell that. We used to do more uranium mining in the United States than we do now. So this has become more of a legacy challenge in terms of the environmental impact of those open uranium mines. Once you've opened that uranium ore to the rain and water, you can have it leach into your waterways. And then, of course, that's just not good for the ecosystem, the environment, and people. So what does in situ mining look like? So basically, think about it as having two wells that you're drilling down to the ore. And in one well, you're putting in either an acidic or a basic solution. It depends a little bit on the ore. And it's basically rusting the uranium out of the ore, and then you're able to bring that uranium up another well. So this is less land disturbing, right, than like open pit mining, for example. It's safer than underground mining, and it's most of what is being done both in the US and in Kazakhstan. So it's kind of the majority way of we're getting uranium. So we found it, we mined it, we got the uranium. Now we have to do some things in order to upgrade it, right? We need to enrich it in order for it to be a fuel for our power plants. Okay, so this is what natural uranium looks like. Remember, U-235. So this is what we get with ore, but we want a higher percentage of U-235, so we have to do enrichment. For our nuclear power plants, we do something that's called low enriched uranium, LEU. That's 3 to 5%. So you're just enriching it from less than 1% up to 3 to 5% of your U-235. For weapons grade, the enrichment is much, much higher. It's over 90% of that U-235. So if you're making it for a bomb, it's much more enrichment has to occur for that uranium. And so I mentioned this in another class, but when auditors are going into a country to look and see if you're enriching uranium for weapons or for nuclear power plants, this is the difference they're trying to figure out. How much are you enriching that uranium? So we've got it from the ore. You don't have to know all these details. I just find them kind of interesting. You're actually rusting it. So, iron turns like reddish when it rusts. Uranium turns yellow. So that's why we kind of associate yellow with uranium. So it makes this kind of yellow cake when you oxidize it. You're basically rusting it. You make it into a gas. And by making it into a gas, you're then able to basically separate it out by the weight of the isotopes. You can do that by diffusion or centrifuge. We pretty much do it all by centrifuge now, which is just like spinning it so that you can have that separation based on the weight of the different isotopes, 235 and 238. And then you can convert it back to a powder, and you put that powder into little ceramic pellets that are the size of that example that I was just passing around, about like a pencil eraser. You make into these little fuel pellets that we're going to stack up and put into our nuclear power plant. So we take those little pellets, we stack them in a big fuel rod, all up on top of each other. We make a big structure of these fuel rods together. So they have these fuel rod assemblies. And then in spaces between the fuel rod assemblies, you have what are called control rods. So the fuel rods are providing that uranium, that chain reaction that's going to happen as the neutrons hit the uranium. But you want a way to shut it off. And so what control rods do are rods that you can put down between the fuel assemblies that will capture those neutrons and shut down the reaction. A lot of times we make those with things like indium or cadmium or boron. It's just something that's going to absorb the neutrons. So one of the safety features you have at a nuclear power plant is you have those control rods above your fuel assembly so that you have your reaction going, but if anything happened or power shut off or something, gravity could put those control rods down into the fuel assembly and absorb the neutrons and shut down your reaction. Okay, does that make sense? And so this gives you a sense of scale of what that's a fuel assembly. Fuel assemblies can just be handled. It's not radioactive yet until you put it into your power plant and had the chain reactions happening and being hit with neutrons. So fuel assemblies, they can just handle it like this. For taking them out of the nuclear reactor, you have to be a lot more careful in how you do that. So now we've brought it through enriching, we've converted it to a fuel. Now we got to put it in our reactors and actually make power. A nuclear power plant is just like a coal-fired power plant, only you're using a nuclear reactor to boil water. So we talked about with our steam cycle power plants, you're just boiling water. In this case, we're using a nuclear reaction to boil water to create steam to turn our turbine. The difference between a similar coal plant and a nuclear plant is the complexity. The safety requirements in a nuclear power plant means that there's often triple redundancy on all your facilities, your people, your monitoring, things like that. So it tends to be a lot more complex than a similar sized coal-fired power plant for safety reasons. And there's two main types of nuclear power plants in the world. Pressurized water reactor and boiling water reactor. And so there's kind of key things here. With a pressurized water reactor, you can see it's the most common, about 70% both globally and the US. You have your nuclear reaction, this is where your reactor vessel is happening. It has water in here that's a moderator. You're taking that hot water because it's within the reaction. You're cross-exchanging it with your steam generator. That's making steam to turn your turbine that comes through, and then you have a cooling loop that cools that water back down. There's 3 loops of water in a pressurized water reactor. It's like the reactor coolant, the working fluid, and the condenser fluid. This is nice because it keeps this radioactive water and everything inside your containment vessel, your reactor vessel. And this vessel is built to withstand, airplanes and things like that. So you're keeping all of that radioactive material inside that containment vessel. The other way we can do it is something called a boiling water reactor, where now you only have two fluid loops. You have the reactant water is actually what's being used to create steam to turn your turbine and be your working fluid. In this case, you can see that radioactive water is actually going outside your containment vessel, so there's a little more safety concern. Anything it touches becomes low radioactive waste. So low-level radioactive waste in terms of like when you have to dispose of it and things like that, and how you have to manage it. This is can be a little bit more efficient because you're creating the steam directly rather than having to cross-exchange it, which isn't quite as efficient as your pressurized water reactor. But it has that additional safety concern and the additional things that you're making low-level waste, radioactive waste. All right, so now we've made power with it. Every once in a while, we have to change out our fuel rods. It's typically, you often are shutting down your nuclear power plant about every 3 years, or your unit every 3 years, to change out some of the fuel assemblies and put in new fuel assemblies into the system. So your reactor will have, depending on the size of the nuclear power plant, will have 24 or 48 or whatever of those fuel assemblies, and then you'll be changing out some of them about every 3 years. For Diablo Canyon, they hire a lot of contractors to do that. They say it about doubles their workforce every well, for them it's about every other year because they have 2 units, in order to do the work for changing out those fuel assemblies. Okay, so we change them out, and now we have radioactive waste, and we have to do something with that. So it's in the reactor, like it says, like for about 3 years. Then you have, most of it is still uranium oxide, but you can see that there's these hot fission products and long-lived products as part of our nuclear waste that's coming out of our reactors. And so you have to have something that is keeping that away from people and other things while that radioactive waste cools down. So when we're talking about high-level waste, that spent waste, some of them are really short-lived and some of them are really long-lived radioactive waste. And so When we're talking about something that has a half-life of 25,000 years, it's going to be hot for more than 100,000, 200,000 years as that comes down. And then I mentioned the low and intermediate level wastes. Those are things that have come in contact with the radioactive fluids. So we have disposal facilities for this low and intermediate waste. We don't have long-term disposal facilities for the high-level waste. And so that just gives you a sense of the scale of the problem that we're looking at. So what do we do with it? Well, first we put it into a swimming pool. That is meant to be in there for about 10 years to cool off and allow some of that stuff to cool off. Then we've started putting it into these concrete casks. You saw a video on this. How long these concrete casks are going to last is uncertain. I've seen estimates from anywhere from 60 to 100 years. It's nowhere near the 200,000 years that we need for the long-term waste. You mentioned Yucca Mountain. That was a research site for maybe being long-term disposal in the United States. It has since been shut down. We're not currently investigating Yucca Mountain anymore as a long-term storage. There really isn't anything going on in the United States figuring out long-term storage. Right now, waste is just continues to be held either in the pools or in these concrete casks on site at the nuclear facilities where it was generated. So we started putting our spent fuel in pools, and our pools kept filling up because we didn't have a long-term solution. And so our pools kept filling up, and now our pools are pretty much at capacity, which is why we started putting them into these concrete casks. We have a lot of nuclear waste to manage, given how long and how big our nuclear industry has been. And so these are just some facts to give you a sense of, both in the United States and the world, how much we're trying to manage. And so we had to do something other than the pools. We started putting them in these dry casks. After they've been in the pool for about 10 years, these hold anywhere from 24 to 40 fuel assemblies. Again, it's uncertain how long they're going to be able to be in these dry casks. This is what it looks like at Diablo Canyon. So this is the water for the pool. So this for the nuclear waste, which is in another part of the facility. And then those are the dry casks where they're storing the nuclear waste right now. They're bolted onto the ground, but they're just open fuel assemblies. Like I said, monitoring it on site. And so even in nuclear power plants, we've shut them down and decommissioned them, like Rancho Seco, which we go to on a field trip. They still have all of the nuclear waste on site, and they still have security around it. And they've kind of consolidated to a certain area, but they still are maintaining security because we don't have anywhere to put that nuclear waste for long-term disposal. Yucca Mountain was going to be that permanent central storage site. There was a lot of research that went into it. What you're trying to find is a place that doesn't have water. You don't want water infiltration into your long-term disposal site because water starts to break down things. It's what can bring that nuclear waste out into the water table or back into the environment. So you want a really dry place. Yucca Mountain's in Nevada. It's very dry. But it's not completely water-free. And so there was challenges in trying to make this completely sealed. There were challenges because Nevada didn't really want the whole country's nuclear waste in its state. And there were challenges because states that are in between the nuclear reactors, most of which that are on the East Coast, didn't want nuclear waste to be transported across their states to get it to Nevada. And so there were some states like Nebraska that just said, we make it illegal to transport nuclear waste across our state. For obvious reasons, right? So there's all of these challenges in terms of thinking about permanent storage for nuclear waste. In the United States, we really have no long-term storage. We stopped collecting funds for the nuclear waste fund during the Obama administration because basically the Obama administration said, we're not doing anything with this funds. We should stop collecting it until we figure out what we're going to do. And I love this. This was the sign we came up with because we were trying to figure out how do we communicate with humans 200,000 years from now that this isn't a good place to be, not knowing what language people will be speaking and all sorts of stuff. Other countries have also obviously trying to grapple with this problem. Finland is opening the first geologic disposal facility France has some research facilities, kind of like we were doing with Yucca Mountain, so they're doing some storage. It is an unsolved problem in lots of places in the world what we do with this long-term storage for radioactive waste. Another thing you can do is recycling. It's called reprocessing. You can recycle some of the spent fuel for reuse. This is what is done a lot in Europe. So in France and other places, they do a lot of reprocessing. It doesn't remove the need to deal with the radioactive waste, but it reduces the quantity that you're having to deal with because you've reused some of it. It is currently illegal in the United States. Congress would have to approve reprocessing in the United States. And the reason really is proliferation concerns. So when you're doing this reprocessing, you're often kind of concentrating up plutonium. And in the United States, the decision was made that that was too risky from a proliferation standpoint. And we made it illegal to do reprocessing of the waste. With that radioactive waste, obviously there are different ways that you worry about proliferation and bombs. One is if you just blow up nuclear waste, that's going to have a lot of impact to the area. But you can also make even more explosive bombs with it, with the plutonium. That is one of the radioactive elements in it. So as long as it remains unseparated in the waste, it's pretty hard to manage, but with reprocessing, it could become more challenging. All right, and then the final stage of our nuclear power plants, once they reach end of life, which we saw with Rancho Seco, we saw with San Onofre, you have to do something called decommissioning. You have to do something to make it safe again in terms of a power plant. And so this is just some of the stages of decommissioning. You have to do something with the spent fuel, things like that. It is a very long process depending on how you're going to do it. There's kind of two ways. A lot of facilities choose a way that takes longer but is cheaper, which is basically you just kind of let some of that radioactive, low-level radioactive waste cool down for, 50 years or so before you start doing anything to take it apart. Because that makes it easier to manage. And so you can see the time frames it takes to do some of these decommissioning processes. We're talking about 50, 60 years for decommissioning a power plant, and it can be very expensive. So they're supposed to collect funds. This is part of your bill when you have a nuclear power plant in order to cover the costs for decommissioning that nuclear power plant. So like on my PG&E bill, I would see a little nuclear power decommissioning charge for the electricity that I'm receiving from Diablo Canyon. All right, let's talk about the environmental impacts and then some of the future stuff in the last 10 minutes class. Okay, you've already seen this. This is one of the reasons that people are excited about nuclear. It's zero carbon. Like other energy resources, there are impacts upstream, midstream, and downstream, thinking about mining, transport, and then, of course, the reactions itself and the concerns that you have. One of the challenges is the mining legacy. I said that we have like 4,000 mines in the United States. Much of those are abandoned, so they become the responsibility of the government to try to clean those up. So there's a lot of challenges with the open uranium mines, and how do we make those safe so that it's not leaking this radioactive material or this uranium material into the waterways. Water use and thermal pollution. So it says, we're using obviously a lot of water just because these are large-scale thermal power plants. It's a little bit more water per megawatt hour than like our coal-fired power plants. And that's just because if you think about our heat engine, part of the coal heat is going straight to the atmosphere out the stack, and not all of it goes into the condenser. Whereas with a nuclear reactor, you don't have that stack. So all of the heat engine heat going to your cold sink has to go to the condenser water. And so it's a little bit more water per megawatt hour. But, it's just large-scale thermal power plants. And then you do worry about contamination, usually more on the mining or research facilities. Humboldt is a prime example of that. Less so, we haven't seen a lot of water contamination from our nuclear power plants. It's mostly been on upstream or in research. Okay, security is a big deal. Literally, we go through things like this when we go to Diablo Canyon. They check us. It takes forever and then people follow us around. We have like a small army of people with guns that follow us around as we go through the tour. This is an actual picture from the Diablo Canyon facility. Security is a big deal. And there's lots of layers of protection because we're worried about containment and terrorism, right? And so that containment vessel has a lot of safety features, and it is also made to withstand an airplane. So if you think about it, these are all costs. Having a small army at your power plant is costs. Having these kind of multiple layers of protection are costs. These are costs that coal, natural gas, wind, solar don't have to bear like the nuclear industry does. And I want to give you a sense that when we talk about nuclear in terms of accidents and safety, it is what we would categorize as a high risk, low probability. We don't have a lot of nuclear accidents, especially compared to how much energy we've used from nuclear. But when we have them, they can be catastrophic. And that's the low probability, high risk of these things. A lot of times it's compared with hydroelectric dams. If a hydroelectric dam fails, that is a very bad situation where anybody downstream could be killed, right? So low probability, high risk type of profile. And if you want to read about how nuclear waste or radioactive waste impacts your body, there's a little bit more about it there. But 3 big accidents have really shaped the nuclear industry, and we've already talked about these. So this is 3 Mile Island in 1979. Really just a small leak of radiation by human error caused a lot of fear and really stopped the nuclear industry. This is from Chernobyl, and the explosion there, and then the fire that was burning for a long time. I have more about that in a second. And then Fukushima. And with Fukushima, it was really the tsunami that killed all of the diesel engines. They had triple redundancy, but all of them were shut off or damaged by the tsunami, so they couldn't operate their safety systems. And so following this, some of the things that we have now required for our nuclear power plants in the United States is they have to have off-site emergency equipment that's close enough that they could fly it in and quickly get their safety systems operating if something made all of them fail at the same time. And so you can just imagine, again, that's added costs. We only have a few minutes, so you can come back and look at these. This is more about 3 Mile Island. You can read more about Chernobyl. That area outside of Chernobyl is still very radioactive, and there was concern about, again, with the Russians' invasions of Ukraine, are they spreading a lot of that radioactive dust as they're marching through some of these areas? And of course, it's impacting the people as they do it. It had a dome over it, and then recently, just 3 years ago, they put another dome over it because that dome was leaking. It's still very much a radioactive site from that accident. And then you can read more about Fukushima. And of course, Fukushima now has challenges that they're trying to get rid of some of their radioactive fluid that the wastewater that's from the facility and the safety systems that they're for cooling down the reactor that was on a runway reaction. And so right now they are releasing that slowly into the ocean because they didn't have anywhere to put it. Pretty controversial. China banned seafood imports from the area from where they're putting that radioactive waste into the ocean. And of course, it had a dramatic impact on their nuclear industry where they went down to 0 and they're slowly bringing some plants back up. Okay, I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about small modular reactors because I know I often get a lot of questions about those. So first, to just give you a sense that this is US nuclear, it's not cost competitive from a levelized cost of energy standpoint. one of the things that people look at for small modular reactors is, could we make them in factories over and over again, have economies of scale, and do nuclear fission at a cost point that would be competitive with other energy resources. The idea for these, so small modular reactors are still fission reactors, still probably using uranium. There's a variety of different kinds. You can go look at some of those. There's a great video if you want to learn more about small modular reactors. But the idea is that they would be cheaper, they would be modular. You would be able to grow the size of your power plant by adding small modular reactors until you get to the size you want, and you would get these economies of scale. There's a lot of different startups and labs and everything that are looking into small modular reactors, but they've faced a lot of challenges and headwinds. So some of the key concerns about small modular reactors is the cost as they're trying to ramp up to scales that would bring them economies of scale. Right now, they pretty much have to go through the same process for permitting as a large-scale nuclear power plant has to go through. So permitting can be challenging. And then there's concern about, will people be accepting of small modular reactors being more distributed, because you're still creating that nuclear waste, and now instead of it being consolidated into a large facility that has big security around it, would you have small modular reactors more distributed? How do you maintain security for that kind of system? So there are significant NIMBY issues with small modular reactors as well. Some studies, and this one is out of Stanford, also show that they aren't as efficient as our large-scale nuclear power plants. And so if you're thinking about how much waste are you creating per kilowatt hour you're getting out, small modular reactors don't, at least with the current designs, don't do as well as our large-scale nuclear power plants. NuScale was going to be the first one. They got it approved. They got a buyer. They were going to started the planning stages and build a small modular reactor. And then inflation happened and everything got more expensive and they were not able to make this happen. So we're really not seeing installation or even demonstration installations of small modular reactors yet. But I would say that there are still some excitement about it. Amazon, others are still putting a lot of money towards small modular reactors, including the US government. So we'll have to see where that goes. Final thing is, what is the future? So I would expect we're going to continue to see growth in Asia. We'll see if we're going to see retirements in the US or things coming back online. I think that's still a question. Nuclear is not expected to be a huge growth portion of future of electricity, but certainly in some regions, like we're seeing in the Middle East, it is going to be a bigger and bigger contributor. All right, that's what I had for you guys today. Thanks for your attention.